the end of World War II, where we had no debt that we owed to other countries. We were a creditor nation. We lent money to others. We're now the world's largest debtor nation, and about half of our debt is held by foreign lenders. China, Japan, oil exporting nations. And who is the largest holder of U.S. debt? Anybody want to guess? It's actually the Federal Reserve. We are buying our own debt. We're buying our own debt in order to hold down interest rates, in order to stimulate the economy, in order to stimulate the housing market. And the fact of the matter is that when that position has to be unwound, we better have taken some steps to put our fiscal house in order, tax and spending policy, and our monetary policy in order, or else we could see a dramatic increase in interest rates. And for every 1% increase in interest rates, it's $150 billion a year in federal spending. And what do you get for that $150 billion? As we say in the South, shinola. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And what about, how do we rank? Americans, think that we medal, meaning top three in about everything. We're used to that. And in many things, we are top three. On the other hand, when you look at fiscal responsibility and sustainability, Australia is number 1, Greece is number 34, and you can probably not surprised by that. And where are we? We're an embarrassing number 28. We're in a bad neighborhood. We need to move up. Mexico is 18. Estonia is number 3. Most Americans don't even know that Estonia is a country. The good news is Australia, New Zealand, Sweden, Canada, a number of the countries that are highly rated had their own challenges in the 90s. They rose to meet the challenge, and now they're rated highly. And in addition, the good news is if Congress and the President could work together to come up with a fiscal reform plan that had the same bottom line impact as the so-called Simpson-Bowles Commission, we would go from 28 to 8. We'd have fiscal sustainability for 40-plus years, and we'd be number 3 in the world in fiscal governance. This is where deficits and debt go in the future, absent a change in course. Obviously not acceptable. What about health care, which is the biggest problem other than interest? We spend double per person and get below average outcomes. What about defense? We spend as much as the next 14 nations combined on defense. And a lot of it is based upon past threats rather than current and future threats. And what about revenues? Well, revenues adjusted for inflation per person have gone up, but not as fast as expenditures. And when you study this carefully, you'll see not all tax cuts stimulate the economy, and very few tax cuts pay for themselves. By that I mean you generate more gross revenues after the tax cut than otherwise you would have. Generally, there's 2 kinds that do that consistently. One, dramatic reductions in marginal tax rates, like what we had during Kennedy's tenure. And secondly, significant reductions in tariffs. But now we have free trade zones, and the top marginal tax rate is 35%. There's not a whole lot of room under that theory at the present point in time. Now, we do have a progressive tax system. The top 0.1% of Americans pay 11% of all taxes. The top 20% of Americans pay 68% of all taxes. That's income and payroll. Here's the problem. I'll come back for a second. 51% of Americans pay no income tax. 51% of taxpayers pay no income tax. That means the majority are on the wagon rather than pulling the wagon. That's got to change. And secondly, the top 1% of Americans pay a median effective tax rate of 18.8%. People like Warren Buffett. Why? Because most of their income is in capital gains. And capital gains is taxed at 15%, and it's not subject to social insurance taxes. So we're going to have to do comprehensive tax reform, and when we do, we're going to have to deal with both of those issues. The fact that 51% don't pay anything, and the fact that income taxes fund all or substantially all the constitutional roles of the federal government, and the fact that the median effective tax rate for the top 1% is 18.8%. And what about states? Of the 50 states, Colorado is ranked 16 in total liabilities and unfunded promises, typically pensions and retiree health care per taxpayer. So you're way above average. You're doing pretty well. Unfortunately, my state of Connecticut is dead last, number 50. And keep in mind, when the federal government has to restructure, bad news flows downhill. It's going to flow downhill to the states. It's going to flow downhill to the local communities, because a typical state relies upon the federal government for 35 to 42% of its revenues. And if you think that's going to continue indefinitely, it's not. And so it's important to get ahead of the curve. These are the kinds of reforms that we need and that are outlined in the Restoring Fiscal Sanity report. We've got to reimpose tough budget controls. We've got to recapture budget flexibility. Right now, over 60% of the budget's on autopilot. We're the only major industrialized nation that writes a blank check for health care. It'll bankrupt us. We can't do that. And so we're going to have to reimpose tough budget controls that will keep Congress and the President from making more promises when we've way overpromised, that will constrain spending, including defense spending, to a more sustainable level. We're going to have to reform Social Security to make it solvent, sustainable, secure, and more savings-oriented. We can exceed the expectation of every generation of Americans by gradually increasing the normal and early retirement ages, by strengthening the benefit for people near the poverty level and people over 85, by providing somewhat less of a benefit for those that are well off, but not turning it into a welfare program. There are things that can be done that will exceed the expectation of every generation, because seniors think they're going to get taken advantage of, and they're not. And young people don't think they're going to get it, and they are. So that means we have an opportunity to exceed the expectation. So why haven't we? No leadership. The biggest deficit this country has is a leadership deficit. Healthcare, we've way overpromised. And the latest health care bill is going to complicate our life. You cannot expand coverage to 32 million people and reduce cost. It's an oxymoron. It absolutely will add cost. It will exacerbate our deficit and debt situation based upon the chief actuary of Medicare, who estimates that it will cost $12 trillion more than the politician said. $12 trillion more. We're going to have to rationalize our promises, change our delivery systems, our tax preferences. We're going to have to focus on how much health care is appropriate, affordable, and sustainable, things like preventative and wellness and catastrophic, rather than the kinds of coverages that we have now, while recognizing government will always do more for the veterans and for the poor. Defense. We're going to have to reduce defense spending without compromising our national security. Believe it or not, the only major area of the federal government that has a forward-looking strategic plan is defense. But guess what? That plan's not resource constrained. And as a result, they have a lot of things that they're doing and that they want to do that we cannot afford and sustain. You need a plan that's focused on opportunities and risk and that's resource constrained. And so that's got to be a change in the defense area, and then we have to have a plan for other areas. We need comprehensive tax reform that will make the system simpler, fairer, more equitable, more competitive, and will generate adequate revenues to pay our bills and deliver on the promises that we intend to keep. We're short now, and we're going to get a lot shorter. And the longer we wait to make these reforms, in my opinion, the higher taxes will go. Why? Because of the miracle of compounding. The longer you wait to make tough choices, the more changes you have to make, the more people who will be enfranchised in existing programs. They tend to vote with a higher, percentage-wise than others. And so as a result, it's critically important that we move to start making changes in all of these areas. And in my view, this joint committee, if it can't come up with at least $1.5 trillion in deficit reduction over 10 years, they should all resign. $1.5 trillion over 10 years. We're running a deficit that large this year, almost that large this year alone. And so they should be able to do that. But no matter what they do, the tough stuff is really not likely to happen until after the 2012 election. The reforms to Social Security, the renegotiation of the health care promises, reforms to Medicare and Medicaid, comprehensive tax reform. And on the comprehensive tax reform, I'll give you an outline. Broaden the tax base So eliminate, consolidate, or better target deductions